Thousands of people displaced by Boko Haram's violence in Nigeria and surrounding states are now in desperate need. How bad is the humanitarian crisis? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Over the last 7 years, the radical group Boko Haram has fought a war that has left thousands of people dead, mainly in northern Nigeria. But the conflict has also spread to the neighboring countries of Chad, Cameroon and Niger. Millions have been displaced and many are now seeking refuge in the Lake Chad basin. They are in dire need of food and children are dying from malnutrition and disease. It is a massive humanitarian crisis. We begin with our correspondent, Sophia Adenga, who joins us from the Nigerian capital, Abuja. And Sophia, the violence caused by Boko Haram is responsible for driving so many of these displaced people to the Lake Chad Basin area. Can you tell us more about how this crisis developed?
Well, the Nigerian government really began to see a consolidation of the group in 2009, and after their leader or spiritual guide, Mohammed Yusuf, died in 2012, you see a more radicalized, a more vocal and more violent Boko Haram under the leadership of Abu Bakr Shekau, systematically raiding villages and causing carnage in much of Nigeria's northeast, and of course trickling down here to the capital of the country. And it's in villages like Mubi and Baga where massive massacres were recorded that the Nigerian government really began to recognize the dangers that were lurking behind this now terrorist group. And of course, coupled with the kidnapping of 276 girls from a local school in Chibok, really culminated in the drastic generation of these displacement populations into neighboring states like Yobe and Adamawa, but also across borders into Cameroon and Chad and Niger. And you know, it's this systematic movement of people and really coming to terms with how to handle these populations in terms of feeding and providing sanitary care and health that has really generated what some UN organizations are calling the worst humanitarian crisis. Anand.
Any idea of how many people have been displaced? And you talk about the humanitarian crisis. How bad is it?
Well, the humanitarian crisis, as it's now being called, is really unfolding even as we speak. We now see populations of almost 2 million displaced in northern Nigeria, but also in the far Cameroon part of Cameroon, you see large numbers there, as well as an area known as Lok in Chad and an area south of Niger known as Difa. And the population differs really, but ideally aid agencies are looking at a number of almost 9 million people. And as we go forward into the next year, you know, food insecurities, cases of acute malnutrition are surfacing, and a lot of these aid agencies scaling up their operations in this geographical zone to really try and cope with these numbers that seem to be growing. And these refugee outflows are being discovered nearly every single day. Anand.
And what's the latest on the fight against Boko Haram? Has there been much progress? Is there any end in sight to the violence?
Well, the Nigerian government has embarked on a campaign, what they are calling Operation Lafiya Dola, which loosely translates into a sort of peace by force, you know, coalition with the rest of the neighboring countries like Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, in really, you know, solidifying a group that will confront Boko Haram in a counterterrorism strategy, but also stressing that in a special situation like this one, sovereignty will take a backseat, and instead these countries will work together in providing you know, a general peace you know, unit that will directly be dealing with Boko Haram. The upside is that, you know, according to many of these watchdog groups that really watch terror groups like Boko Haram, there has been a significant registering of 30% less deaths that are attributed directly to Boko Haram. However, there is this spillage of Boko Haram into these neighboring countries that has seen considerable violence from the group, and it's hoped that the Nigerian government is addressing this need of protecting not only its sovereign state, but also the neighboring countries that are affected. Anand.
Thanks, Sophia. That's CCTV correspondent Sophia Dengo reporting from Abuja in Nigeria. And joining me now from the United Nations is Stephen O'Brien. He is the Under-Secretary General and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Put this crisis in some kind of perspective for us. How big is it?
Well, it's huge, and it's been growing, and very, very rapidly. For a good period of time, well over a year, I and other colleagues in the United Nations, but particularly as the Emergency Relief Coordinator and as Under-Secretary in charge of Humanitarian Affairs, I have been raising the issue about the massive growing humanitarian needs in particularly the Lake Chad Basin and northeastern Nigeria, centered around Maiduguri and that area in Borno State, where Boko Haram has been wreaking its heinous fighting and oppression of people for so long. And now that the security situation has been being able to push back some of the Boko Haram, albeit there continues to be very intense fighting and security worries, and there has been back and forth, nonetheless, both with the flight of people across borders and internally displaced, and the very severe pressure this has put upon food supplies, access to medical care, and access for women and children in particular for their protection, we have seen an escalating amount of need. And in particular, when you ask me about the size, when I look at the 4 countries affected, so we have primarily northeastern Nigeria, but also Niger, Cameroon and Chad, and they all have hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people who are now both in real peril and real risk and have been continuing to do so. In particular, we have about 16.2 million people. This is double from when I was talking about this only 3 or 4 months ago, who are now at risk, of whom about 14 million are in northeastern Nigeria alone. And there is an increasing recognition by the federal government of Nigeria, who have put together an interministerial task team in order to try and meet the coordinated needs with the government of Nigeria, for us as the United Nations and all our implementing agencies and partners, particularly the World Food Programme and UNICEF, focused on children, that we are now really scaling up, and huge numbers of people are being reached in terms of their needs. 3 million out of that 14 million in northeastern Nigeria so far being met. But that is clearly inadequate, clearly insufficient. And in particular, when you look at the 14 million, 7.7 million, that's over half, are in severe malnutrition, many of whom are children. And we are reaching as many as we can. But at the moment, for the appeals that we've put out, the financial appeals, the money, the cash that buys the programs, that we can have our brave aid workers out there reaching the people, is only 39% funded. So that means that we're short of $6 out of every 10 that we need in order to be able to scale up to meet the huge, massive scale, as you rightly hinted in your opening question.
You talk about children. They must be the most vulnerable in this crisis. What can you tell us about their plight?
Well, children, yes, certainly are the most vulnerable, because of course you've got to remember, when you have malnutrition, not only do children suffer most quickly, most severely, but of course it leaves long-lasting effects, whether it's stunting or their development, which it's almost impossible ever to recover. But we need very rapidly to get the very high energy, high protein foods into them in order to help them recover. And whether this is in Diffa, where that's in Niger, where I was in May, June this year, where the needs have doubled. We've got many, many people fleeing from northeastern Nigeria across what is only effectively a dried up stream bed into that part of southeastern Niger. And there the children and the women, and indeed many of the elderly, some of the chronically sick, are all in dire need of support in a country which is very, very willing and coordinated and cooperating with the international community. But Niger has already very severe chronic issues for malnutrition, for the support needed for wash, that's water and sanitation and hygiene, and for medical access. and that's reaching something in the region of 1 million people. Then go to northeastern Nigeria again, and children, of course, their protection is absolutely vital. When you have so many stories, not least you'll be well aware of the Chibok girls, where they have been held against their will, and many would argue brainwashed into now being part of what Boko Haram have sequestered them, and the abuse and the terrible treatment that has been heaped out on those girls, on all the other women and children, and indeed some young boys and young men who've been forced to be fighters against their will. And so these are the protection issues, in addition simply to the life-saving, life-supporting issues, such as food, water, access to medicines, which also we're doing everything we can to scale up and to meet those needs.
Now, you're describing a crisis there of major proportions. Are you, as the UN's man in charge of relief coordination, prioritizing what you need? Is it more personnel, more money, more aid, or a combination of all of these things?
Well, of course, the answer to that is, I'm afraid, it is all these things. But yes, we have to prioritize. We have no choice. The world has got many crises around. We can't put ourselves into a competition with other crises where human suffering takes place. It is our job as world citizens, as the United Nations, impartially, independently, at all times, completely neutrally, to meet those needs, irrespective of how they have arisen, who has the needs, and where they are. And at any time, we demand safe, unimpeded access. These are the humanitarian principles which the world signed up to. And under international humanitarian law, we absolutely need to work, particularly with the governments where we can. And as I say, the federal government of Nigeria and the local governor of Borno State and the other neighboring states, Adamawa and Gombe, in all the other neighboring states of northeastern Nigeria, we're working with the local governments in order to have the access that we need, unimpeded, and we need to make sure that we keep a distinction in order to protect the very brave and determined, committed aid workers at some distance from the security forces. That's always necessary in order to ensure protection of the aid workers. But above all, we need to prioritize getting food to meet the severe malnutrition issues for children and all those who are chronically in need of energy and high-protein foods to help them recover from what otherwise is a life-threatening condition. We need to make sure they have access to water, although that's slightly easier in these conditions, although by no means guaranteed, particularly for drinking water that's not going to carry communicable and infectious disease. And waterborne diseases, as you know, is one of the most debilitating things that happens in a crisis.
Right.
But also particularly access to healthcare. So yes, prioritization, particularly through the World Food Programme and through UNICEF, and the coordination of that is absolutely vital. And it's very interesting to see how some international and local NGOs have also been able, after we've been calling this and we've got our people mobilized and moving in, have been able also to confirm in certain particular localities the depth of crisis that we're facing, and are also able to contribute their complementary support for all that we're doing. So I'm pleased that coordination is really taking root.
Okay, Stephen, we're going to have to leave it there. Stephen O'Brien, thanks for joining us. We need to take a short break right now. Much more on this devastating humanitarian crisis when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. A major humanitarian crisis is taking place in the Lake Chad Basin area of Africa, where tens of thousands have fled the violence caused by Boko Haram. Joining us now from Munich is Etta Ewane. He is a professor of international relations and an expert on sub-Saharan Africa. Also with us from Nairobi is Richard Moncrief. He is the Central Africa Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Welcome to both of you to the show. Etta Ewane, let me start with you. You know this region very well, northern Nigeria and the Lake Chad region. This is not a region that's easily accessible, and it's of course made more insecure by the Boko Haram attacks. How much of a factor does this play in seeking out some solution to this crisis?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And like you rightly put it, especially the northern part of Nigeria, it's not easily accessible. And this is exactly the area where Boko Haram originated from. the northern part of Cameroon as well, where Boko Haram is having most of its activities, it's also not really accessible. Yeah, why they came to this area, it is obviously because of the low levels of development in these areas. Most of the governments in this area have created a vacuum that Boko Haram is actually comfortably occupying at the moment. Levels of development in the area are really very low, and this has increased because of the low levels of development in the governments have created a situation in which all the aspirations of the young people in the area have sunk into an abyss of hopelessness, and while at the same time increasing the attractiveness of Boko Haram. So the government has created a vacuum in which Boko Haram has settled, and the Boko Haram has become actually a real alternative to the young people in the area. Boko Haram is offering jobs to these people and pay remunerative employment, something that most of the governments in the region have not been able to do. This is why it has become very easy for Boko Haram to settle in this area. And this is why it is becoming increasingly difficult to find a solution, because Boko Haram is an attractive alternative.
Okay, Etta, I want you to take a listen to part of a report on what this crisis is doing to children in this region. Let's watch.
On the brink of death, 2-year-old Abdullahi is dying from hunger. His mother can barely watch as a team of doctors work to save her son. This intensive care unit is in Maiduguri, in northeast Nigeria, where many victims of Boko Haram have fled, seeking refuge.
So how deadly, Etta, is this crisis for children? How vulnerable are they from a lack of medical care, malnutrition?
I think the children are the highest victims of the conflict. Now, this is a conflict that started as an armed rebellion of a certain terror group against governments in the region. But the resultant humanitarian crisis has become really deadly. Now, we have about, following the latest estimates from the United Nations, there are about 2.3 million people, internally displaced people in the region. And according to the International Crisis Group, there are about 2.6 million people displaced in the region. And most of the people are children and women. And there is a high influx of diseases, a high influx of disease in the area. And because the area is also difficult to access, it has made it really difficult for humanitarian organizations to operate in the area. And also the availability of resources for these humanitarian organizations to operate also. Following the International Crisis Group report, I think about 22% of the necessary funds have been made available as of now, and therefore it becomes really difficult. So the children who actually need help, the help is difficult to come, and the children are really dying.
Richard, what is your assessment of the crisis in the region and the international response? The UN has been taking some criticism for not acting fast enough.
Sure. Well, I agree with a lot of what the professor has just said, and I think that a large part of the problem is that these are areas which are somewhat neglected by the state. But I'd also like to add that in some cases the state, or the state security forces in particular, have made things worse, and that's particularly the case in Nigeria, where a very heavy-handed response by the army back in 2010 really is at the origin of this crisis. So it's not just about state neglect, it's also about mistakes that have been made along the way. As concerns the humanitarian aspect of this crisis, again, I'd agree with the professor. This is a profound crisis that is affecting women and children very deeply. The UN, the UN, of course, has many humanitarian agencies on the ground. They have a very difficult time accessing the areas where most of the violence is taking place, as has been mentioned, although we should say that that violence has declined To some degree this year. It reached a peak in 2014 and the beginning of 2015, and the situation has improved in most areas, although not all. And we have seen a number, well, actually quite a significant number of surrenders of Boko Haram members in Chad very recently. So the picture isn't all bleak.
Richard, you talk of the very heavy-handed response by security forces in this area. What's the alternative? They are dealing with a very violent group here, a group that, as we know, have kidnapped children, have attacked villages, have killed people.
Sure, but there's no doubt that a military response is required, and I would never disagree with that. You know, if you, as an army, go into villages and start shooting people without arresting them, you lock hundreds, if not thousands, of people up with very little hope of a trial. What happens is you build a resentment in the population, and that resentment can be part of the reason that groups like Boko Haram can then grow. So I really, I don't disagree with a military response. It is a necessary part of the equation, but it's no good sort of attacking all guns blazing. In the end, that kind of approach can backfire, as we have certainly seen in the Lake Chad Basin area with Boko Haram.
Right, and Etta, looking at the humanitarian situation there, we talked a moment ago about malnutrition. Is this an area that produces food? Can farmers go about and grow food there?
Yeah, it's difficult for farmers to grow food because of the increasing insecurity. But before I continue on this, I think I would like to come back on the point just made by Richard, because I know there's been a lot of criticism about the way the army has been handling this crisis. I made a trip to the northern part of Cameroon, precisely in Marwa, in July of this year, and I had the opportunity to see for myself how things have been evolving. I think the reaction from the military has been largely a result of increased frustration amongst the military men. And this is because the Boko Haram has changed its tactics over the years. They've resorted to using children and frustrated young people now as suicide bombers. So now the army is dealing with an enemy who is not known, and it becomes difficult for the army to lead the combat. So everyone becomes a suspect in the region. Of course, I'm not saying that the army is I'm not supporting everything the army is doing, and I share the same opinion with Richard. It's not, the solution is not only military. I think the governments in the region need to address the root cause of the problem, why it has become so easy for Boko Haram to recruit combatants in these regions, especially in the northern part of Cameroon. I mean, there are reports that about 4,000 young men have been recruited as combatants of Boko Haram over the past few years, and this number is alarming. So the government needs to address some of the economic problems that the regions are facing, create a sufficient, adequate infrastructure. I mean, here, both physical and soft infrastructure that can help to address some of the development challenges that these regions are facing.
No, I was just going to say that it's caused the violence, and the instability in the region has caused enormous dislocation. Richard, I want you to take a listen to a woman who lost her husband in an attack in a village there. Let's watch this. So Boko Haram have been carrying out these attacks not just in northern Nigeria. These attacks have been taking place in Cameroon, in Niger, in Chad as well. I mean, what do you see happen here? Is this crisis going to continue indefinitely?
Well, I mean, I'd come back to something I said earlier, which is we have seen some degree of improvement of the situation over the last 9 months. But let me also just pick up a question you asked earlier about people able to plant, and is agriculture able to go on? As the professor said, it's been heavily disrupted by Boko Haram. It's also to some degree been disrupted by government measures. Borders have been closed, some transport routes have been shut down. Of course, those are security measures, but they also have an impact on the population. One thing I would just add to give a sort of picture of the area is that although a lot of the area is quite poor, Lake Chad itself is a very agriculturally rich area, and we see Boko Haram at the moment has rather taken shelter in the islands of Lake Chad, and I think there's good reason to believe that they are living off the fishing industry, which is a major part of the local economy. So you see inserting itself into the local economy. They've also very well known for stealing cattle, and of course that has an immense and terrible impact on people.
So we hear sometimes this crisis in this part of Africa being referred to as the forgotten crisis. Is the world not paying enough attention to what is going on there?
I think the world is not paying sufficient attention, and this can be justified by the simple fact that the conflict is in Africa, and this is a hard fact, but we actually have to face it. I mean, there's always been a general apathy when it comes to conflicts in Africa. Now we've seen the world taking robust action to end conflict in some regions of other regions of the world, but when it comes to Africa, we see this general apathy. And this is the case in the Lake Chad Basin. Now, you talk to people in the street in the West, most of them know little about this conflict, despite the fact that Boko Haram has emerged as one of the most dangerous terror groups in the world. People know little about it. And also to come back to the question on agriculture, I just wanted to add that the Lake Chad serves also as a source of irrigated agriculture in the region. And unfortunately, like Richard said, Boko Haram has occupied most of taken refuge in the area of Lake Chad, and most of the farm fields have actually been transformed into minefields. So it becomes dangerous for farmers to go to the fields.
Richard Moncrief, thanks to both of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You will find that at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.